Oh, community.
Community.
Community is...
What's it mean to have community?
I don't even know. Community is such a hard word now.
It seems to be the thing that everyone is chasing, but very few people know how to be a part of anymore. You know, it's a place where you experience life with one another and know you're accepted.
We need community.
If you're not known, you cannot be loved.
But we're definitely coming at this from different places.
Well, welcome back to the Grounded Presence Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Powell. And I've often said this thing to my wife. I've said that I need more people in my life that I can just grunt with, just communicate on this level that's deeper than what words can express. Now, when I say grunt, I'm not talking about this classic macho man, Tim Allen grunt. Now, that's not it. What I'm talking about are these rare moments in conversation where you're so in sync, so in step with whoever you're talking to that words just seem to fail. You know, words can't communicate the things that are going on inside of you deeply enough. You know, it's these moments of communication where it's not merely words being spoken, but we're connecting in this deeply human, deeply primal way. You know, it's these moments where you and a friend see something absolutely crazy happen, and they just shoot you this glance that says it all. And it's like the only words that you can possibly utter at that point is just like, dude, oh, those guttural grunts, they say it all. Those grunts just say it all. And you both know exactly, what is meant. Experiencing the same moment in the same way, from the same perspective even. And that's a super rare thing. But before I go any further on this fool's errand of trying to describe indescribable interactions, I want to introduce you to this guy, Joe Burnham. So get ready for some serious conversation because this guy brings it. So he's a funeral officiant in Denver, Colorado. And I think the only way I can really introduce him is that he is a man who has some deep knowledge about how we communicate and how we relate to each other as human beings. And I've known Joe to be a guy who goes deep. So I approached him and I said, hey, Joe, I can't explain it, but I feel like there's something really profound to be said about community in the context of funerals. And he thought there was too. And you know, I don't know if we neatly packaged it up for you. But I think we truly had one of the best conversations yet to air on this podcast. And time again in this conversation, I just found myself filled with those deep, primal, visceral grunts. Just, whoa. Using some language from Henry Nouwen. It's those grunts that say, you say what I only suspected. You clearly expressed what I vaguely felt. You bring to the forefront the things that have been knocking around in the back of my mind. We did record this conversation back in February, right before Corona hit. And I think this conversation speaks even louder now than it would have then. And please take note, there is a little bit of strong language in this episode, particularly in the second half. Well, hey, Joe, I'm really excited to be talking to you today. Thanks so much for taking the time. So you're a funeral officiant out there in Denver, Colorado.
I am a freelance funeral officiant. I work with primarily one funeral company. And when a family comes in and has nobody who fills a pastor, priest, rabbi, spiritual leader role in their life, then the funeral company will say, hey, we've got somebody who can meet with you, who can go through this process, who can actually speak at the funeral itself and can do all that. So you're not in a spot where you're having a family member or somebody like that trying to figure those things out and navigate those circles. So I walk in with families I don't know that just lost someone that they love.
So it sounds like a lot of your role is really just the comfort of being somebody knows what to do in this situation, like in this traumatic situation.
Absolutely.
Cool.
I mean, it's so often families are just, they're overwhelmed. They don't know what the heck to do. And with more and more families not being associated with a church or some sort of religious body that has somebody that normally would fill that role in their lives, who comes in when that chaos happens, I jump in that moment. So they're not sure what to do, and it's interesting because I often wonder what that's like for families, because it's like, wait a second, this person that never met our loved one is going to speak at our loved one's service. How's that work?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, which is maybe even another dynamic as we play into the idea of community on all this, because I come in as the outsider to the community.
Well, this is just such an interesting interview to me. You know, I threw this idea out to you about like, hey, Joe, let's talk about funerals and community. And I've just been like, you know, kicking myself in the head for a few weeks, trying to get like an angle on it. I'm like, okay, how do these things connect? You know, like, how are they interrelated? And like, I couldn't come up with anything direct, you know, but I just have this like intuition that there's something really important there. I'm hoping you can explore that a little bit, and maybe with your insight, I feel like you know there's something important there too. I just can't neatly package it. So at first it seems counterintuitive, right? Because it's like death. It's like that's the ultimate loss of one's community. You know?
Well, and I think that's the thing, is that a funeral is initiated because there has been a breach in community. Part of the community has been taken away. You've lost community. And so the whole reason you initially gather is that community has been broken. And I think the reason that you gather in some ways is to try and, I always talk about, it's a new normal. So you're trying to figure out, how do we rebuild or how do we restructure this community? So community dynamics, I mean, you can even go and look at, like, with sort of an odd way out there example that seems totally disconnected, but I think there's something here. When somebody is an alcoholic, their role in the community is to be the alcoholic. And so everybody else in the community, their function and their engagement in the community relationship is built around their role with the alcoholic. How do I cover for them? How do I enable them? How do I put pressure on them to change, or shame them, which actually often will perpetuate the addiction? So everything gets built around the fact that this individual is the alcoholic. And when you take this, somebody, you know, recognizes that, they go into 12 steps, they go to rehab, they come back and they're clean and they're sober. The rest of the family doesn't know how to engage with them sober.
Because they still have their communal role as the alcoholic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They still have the role of the one who facilitates and supports the alcoholic. And so often the family presses, not like intentionally, but the family ends up pressing the person back into alcoholism, because otherwise it forces them to change their dynamic and their role and their understanding of the community and the relationship.
Yeah.
So when the alcoholic comes back into the home or comes back into the family setting, everybody else has to change.
Right.
Well, when there's been a funeral, somebody has been pulled out, and now everybody else has to change, because all of those relationships and all of those dynamics and all of those interactions, there was some level of triangulation going on where the way I relate to you is contingent upon my relationship with the person who has now died. So if the person who has now died is out of the system, then that triangulation no longer exists. So I need to figure out a new way of relating to you.
Yeah. Yeah, especially in the case of older people, you know, because sometimes families will, you know, have just ways of engaging family. Like you always meet at grandma's house for, you know, whatever celebration or something. Then you got to figure out a new way to celebrate, you know, whatever holiday or event that was kind of the hub of, you know?
And what happens when your parents go back to their parents' house? all of a sudden they function like they're 13 years old again because they're back to being kids. They're back in the house they grew up in. They're back around the parents who had this certain relationship with them. I had a professor who once said, when it comes to family, you're always 13 years old and your parents never die. You know, there's this lingering effect of that individual over how you understand yourself and how you function in that community environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a sense, then because there's all of this interconnectedness and all of these interrelationships, and all of a sudden something's been pulled out of that we need to figure out a new normal. And if we don't begin to figure out how to start functioning differently, and we keep functioning the same, then it gets really dysfunctional. I think in a sense, a funeral is it's how do I remember this person? How do I process the loss I'm experiencing right now? How do I process the new relationship dynamics that I am entering into? Which is especially hard if you don't want new relationship dynamics. You know, in the case of an untimely death or something like that, you know, one of these funerals I just did, the couple had been married and then they divorced. The romance was just rekindling and they were coming back together, and he died. And there's so much emotion that gets caught up in that, and so many connections, and so much breach in community, but also so much inside that says, I don't know how to function in this new setting. A funeral is trying to handle and hold all of that.
Now, when we had talked before, you used a little different term. I think you called it a fracture in community.
Yeah, a fracture, yes. Community has been broken, and that fracture needs to be healed. And if you don't heal that fracture, then it just, you know, it becomes a gaping wound that just sits there. And what happens when a gaping wound sits there? It gets infected.
Well, how crazy is it? Like all the things that people have to do after a funeral, like settling an estate, when there's all these heavy emotions and like big adjustments that have to be made, you know, like you're just talking about, even just around how does our community take this loss on, you know? And then it's like, oh, now we have to divide up money. Like that sounds like a great idea, you know?
Yeah, the fact that stuff happens that way it's horrific. That, I mean, so often you're sitting down with families and they're in shock. B, they've spent the last few days doing nothing but paperwork and trying to handle logistics while in a state of shock. And there's been no space for them to grieve. There's been no space to process emotion. And if you look at like from a trauma, like a somatic therapy sense with trauma, Peter Levine is a therapist that has done a lot of this, where he watches how animals function in a traumatic situation. So the rabbit is out in the field. The rabbit becomes aware of the fox. Adrenaline rushes through the rabbit's body, and it sprints off and charges away from the fox until it eventually lands in a space where it's safe. It finishes quaking and moving through all of the rush of the adrenaline and the energy. And 60 seconds later, it's back to where it was before the fox existed. And it's almost as if the fox was never there. Mm-hmm. So it has had a traumatic reaction. It has processed the traumatic reaction. It now moves on. And with people, we often don't create space or give ourselves space to actually process that reaction. And so it just sits in the body.
I like this image of the rabbit. Like that really resonates with me, because when I have like that grief or just that shock that I'm not processing, the image that comes to me a lot of that is just like this cold, shivering, like traumatized rabbit under a bush that like just got chased down by a fox, and it's just like, oh, you know, it's just like buzzing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think that's how it actually looks, you know, in the natural world, but it's an image that's useful to me of what's going on inside.
There are probably some moments where it does look like that, in the sense that all of the adrenaline and all of those hormones and all of the stuff that got launched because of this life-threatening situation and the attack of the fox has to finish moving through the system.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't move through the system, then it stays in the system. And that's one of the biggest differences between the majority of animals in the animal kingdom and human beings, is that we often do not allow that stuff to finish moving through our system.
Or we try to not even show it most of the time, you know?
Exactly. We just try and cover it up and hide it and suppress it and push it down and not deal with it. And then it's going to figure out a way out.
Yeah.
Or it's just going to sit there and weigh on us or curse us, or, you know, it eventually needs to something needs to be done with it. And whenever community's been ripped apart like that, then we've got to do something to process and put it back together. And I think often, not exclusively, but often, as odd as it sounds, the way to do that is community.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you get into this work in the first place? I mean, it seems like a really interesting profession to find yourself in.
Yeah, well, on my tagline for a bunch of stuff, I described myself as a recovering Lutheran pastor. And so my earliest funeral experiences came back when I was ordained LCMS pastor. So it was a really conservative wing of the Lutheran Church here in the States. And it was the church I grew up in and became a pastor in ultimately, and have since, I don't think wandered away from, I think it's more sprinted away from, or repeatedly sprinted away from. I don't know exactly how that works, but anyway. And so that's where I initially landed, was I just developed some experience that way. And actually found that I enjoyed crafting the messages. I enjoyed speaking in that context. I found that on an Enneagram, I'm a 4. So I'm one of the sort of characteristics of that personality is I'm able to have equanimity. I'm able to hold all of the emotions in the room and yet not be overwhelmed by any of them. And so I sort of have a personality characteristic that just lets me sit well in that environment. And I did back then. And then fast forward a number of years, I left ministry that way a little over 9 years ago. But about 3 years ago, I work at REI, which is a outdoor recreation store, and I work in the footwear department. One day it was a quiet day, and I have a young woman come in, and we're just having an interesting conversation as I'm going about fitting her and making recommendations on shoes. And she just had a really quirky personality, and I wasn't exactly sure what to make of her, and just sort of said, "Hey, I've just got to ask, what do you do for a living?" Because it was so funky, because she had this really sort of East Coast, very professional, very put together, and yet she was like stressing about buying an extra pair of shoes. Do I really need hiking shoes for this kind of thing? And so it was this weird, odd dynamic in her personality. And I was just like, okay, she's interesting. She's quirky. There's something different going on. And then she's like, oh, I'm a funeral director. And I thought, well, that seals the deal. There's definitely it was just fun. And so we started talking about that. And I finally just sort of said, hey, do you guys ever need people that come in and do this freelance? And she looked at me, she's like, all the time. And I said, well, this is my background. And if you're looking for somebody, I would love to come work with you guys at some point. I hadn't done a funeral in, 8 years at that point, but it was just that conversation. And so she, a couple months later, got me on a job and was like, wow, you did an amazing job with that. And then started hiring me more. And then people in her office started, she would refer me to other people in the office, and they would use me to do a funeral. And lately, although it's been quiet the last couple of weeks, I mean, I had a week not too long ago where I had a funeral on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday.
Wow, that's a lot of funerals.
It was interesting because the first one was the most challenging, in the sense that it was a 47-year-old. And that's the thing I think that some of these that really hit is because I've found that more and more I'm doing funerals of people my parents' age, and I'm doing funerals of people my age. And like when they're my age, it's never expected. I'm 45. And so like in the last month, I've done a 47 and a 48-year-old, neither of whom had cancer or some long-term illness or anything like that. It was just, heart gave out or, and it's those weird, like, wait, that's not supposed to happen right now kind of things. And so that's where that trio kicked off, was with one of those. The rest of the weekend, it was, one was a woman she was younger, but she had battled an illness for decades. And so it was like she and her husband had gotten married, and 6 months later, she found out that she had MS. And, 37 years with MS. So there was when she did pass away, it was like, okay, it's, you can start to say things like, hey, she's not suffering anymore. And there's some comfort in that. And there's some relief in that. It's that you've watched this person that you love who's been hurting for so long, and now you know that pain is over. The other one, it was an older woman who it was just time, and see, those are easier to do. Those are more reflective back on a full life. And so there it's, you get the opportunity to do more of the celebration kind of thing, because you're celebrating the life that was lived, as opposed to someone who's younger, where you're trying to explain something that can't be explained. I think that's where it goes wrong, is when you try and explain something that can't be explained.
Yeah. Oh man, it sounds like you're the perfect person to be doing funerals, because you got that, just that personality where you said you can hold all the emotions in the room and not be overwhelmed by any of them. It's like, man, there's a lot of emotions going on in a funeral procession. You know what I mean? It's like, ooh.
Absolutely.
But,
well, it's because go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, preparing for our conversation, it was interesting, like at some point it just hit me how cool funerals really are in a sense, right? Because it's like this, it's really, I think, the only pretty much absolutely universal human ritual. Because if someone passes, like that's close to people, like they always gather to memorialize them or to process the experience of losing them. And just like, how cool is it that you get to facilitate that? I mean, I think every other ritual that I could think of, like some people don't get married, like having a kid isn't always like a celebration, you know what I mean? But like if there's people around you, there's going to be a funeral in some sense, like when you die,
Mm-hmm. And I think the thing is that's often amazing, and this strikes me when you say that, is that I've had a couple where, well, no, I've had one where the people who were left in charge of the funeral, the next of kin. I mean, I had one, it was a few years back, but I got in there and started talking with the family, and it was the brother. It was a woman who had never married, who had died. And so her brother was listed as the next of kin. And he was like, yeah, she was my weird sister and she liked dogs. And that was like basically all he said about his sister. And that was like all he gave me to work with on his sister. And we're like, yep, need to do a service. And we live different lives, and I don't agree with her stuff, and I don't know how we're going to do this. I mean, and it turns out that I actually, of all weird things, it's the only funeral I've done where I also knew the people beforehand. I didn't realize that I knew them until I got there, and I didn't even actually recognize him. But then he started talking about his church background, and I realized that when I was a pastor, I had done an internship at the church where he attends. And I'd probably served this guy communion, half dozen times, if not more. And so there was this, it was a bigger church. And so there's no reason that I would continue to remember necessarily, or, you see so many faces when you're in that role. And I was only there for a year. And So there's a number of people you get to know, and others you sort of recognize, and then you move on. But I was like, oh my gosh, I know, I knew more of the story. I knew more of the background because I knew the theology. I knew what his assumptions might have been, the things he wasn't saying about his sister at that time. I mean, he essentially very well could have been saying, well, yeah, she's in hell now, so I don't know what you're going to do with that. Was sort of what he was coming at, which was, you could see that there'd been, in a community sense, that there'd been this breach for a long time. And so he couldn't even imagine anyone coming to his sister's funeral. He couldn't imagine a community coming to gather around her. But of all things, thankfully, they mentioned that she volunteered at the Denver Dumb Friends League, which is an animal shelter. And I happen to know somebody who used to work and do HR at the Dumb Friends League. And so I was able to contact her and get the story on this woman. And to just add things to another level on all this, I had done a thing after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. A number of dogs were brought to Colorado, and they ended up having to euthanize them because the dogs were so traumatized from what they experienced in the hurricane that they were no longer safe around humans. And this group of people at the Dumb Friends League had poured their hearts into the lives of these dogs. And so for them to put them down was just horrific for this community. And she came to me and said, hey, I don't know if you've ever done anything like this, but could we do some kind of like funeral service for the dogs? And so I'd actually gone in then and put together a memorial service for the dogs. And so the people in this community had met me then, and they met me when one of their volunteers unexpectedly committed suicide, and I came in and did a little service at the Dumb Friends League. And then she dies. And so this group of people that I'd worked with twice before in this context, they show up in mass at her funeral. And her brother's just sitting there going, what the heck?
Whoa.
And so the community that gathered for her was not the community that you normally would think of in that context. And so thankfully I had that connection in those relationships, and I was able to turn around and do a whole piece that really connected to the life that she loved, and in a way was able to, I think in a way that was unexpected, I was able to actually serve the brother and the family there by helping them see a different side of the sister, the aunt, all of that.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So piggybacking on the concept of fractured community, not only has a fracture in community occurred in one of these funerals that you're officiating, but you're also going to be giving this to a fractured community, right?
Yeah.
Because every group of people is going to have fractured beliefs about the afterlife and fractured beliefs about what it means to live a good life. So when you're speaking to this fractured group of people, like, how do you go about compassionately facilitating a meaningful ceremony for like such a diverse set?
Yeah, normally when I do a funeral, I start, we'll do a welcome, and I'll welcome the most important people who are there, and then we'll read a eulogy that talks about the person's life, and then we'll like have a slideshow of some videos and songs and stuff like that. Some people might get up and say some things, memories about their loved one, and then I'll do some sort of piece at the end that's sort of like, how do we carry the memory of this person forward well? How do we live from what we've learned? Often, a friend of mine is still a Lutheran pastor in St. Louis once said, he would take something in the life of the person that he picked up on that mirrored some characteristic of the divine, and would talk about how we could carry forward or continue to image the life of this person by remembering this characteristic. Whether it's generosity or compassion or service or whatever the case may be. And So I'll play with something along those lines. I did one recently where the woman who died was, I mean, when I first sat down with her kids, they looked at me and they're like, we have no clue what you're going to do with this. Our mom she just bucked the system. The grandkids used to take bets on when she dropped the first F-bomb when she walked in the room. She just didn't do the normal, quote, good, proper person thing. And so I talked about the spiritual gift of impropriety, or the spiritual discipline of impropriety, and saying that when we buck the system and when we do the unexpected, it forces us to rest in comfort in who we are as people. So, maybe we need to learn a lesson from her, that while we looked at this and so have seen this behavior for so long as like embarrassing or something to joke about, or, give them a new perspective on the life of this loved one that they weren't sure what to do with. Said, maybe she had something going on. Maybe there's some radical self-acceptance that she had going on, and we would all be better off if we followed her lead and engaged occasionally in the spiritual discipline of impropriety.
Now, impropriety, define that word.
So not being proper.
Yeah.
Not doing the proper thing, not and I think this gets to some of what you're talking about in this other question. What I'll do normally in a ceremony, especially when it's somebody who's lived a full life and that kind of thing, I try and give the people something to hold on to from the life of that person. But when it's like one of these younger people, and when I've done this sort of general layout a couple times now. So it's that unexpected fracture, which is far more traumatic and far more hurtful than the expected fracture. I start out, I'll do the welcome, I'll read the obituary, and I'll say, before we say anything else today, we need to talk about something. This sucks. And usually those are my words. This sucks. This is not right. This is not good. We should not be here. And then I'll pull from the person's life. What we should be doing is this, or this, or this. And they offer these different examples of what the family would normally be doing during that time. And say all of those things would be okay right now, but not this. Because when it comes to funerals, there's this sense of people don't know what to say, so they say really dumb things. Oh, he's not suffering anymore. Yeah, but he wasn't suffering. They say there's a silver lining in this. Where's a silver lining when a teenage girl's dad just died? Where's a silver lining when a parent buries a child? There's no silver lining in that. God must have needed him more. Wait a second. You are telling me that a self-sufficient, all-sustaining, perfectly content in and amongst God's self, God, needed this person more than their spouse did? That God is selfish and horrific and vile and evil. That is, if that's the case, then Christopher Hitchens is right and God is not good. So we end up saying things like that because we're trying to spiritualize it and make it all okay. But really it just, and I've actually had funerals where I've sat there and said, if that's the God that we're supposed to believe in, then I'm with you as an atheist. I don't believe in that God. And so it takes all of these things that the family is beginning to suspect and wonder, but they can't say because that would be inappropriate. That's impropriety. You can't talk about God that way. And I just lay it out there and say, boom, there it is. This is true. And and I know pastors aren't supposed to say that kind of stuff, but you know what? I'm standing here in a pastoral type role and I'm saying it. This is true. And then I say, but maybe there's a different way that we can think about the divine.
So there's this Henry Nouwen quote that I think you'll love. I just looked it up here, but it's in this context. Preaching means more than handing over a tradition. It's rather a careful and sensitive articulation of what is happening in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So those who can listen can say, "You say what I only suspected. You clearly express what I vaguely felt. You bring to the fore what I fearfully kept in the back of my mind. Yes, you say who we are. You recognize our condition."
Okay, you need to send me that quote, because that's like that. I mean, in a sense, that's what I aim to do all the time. In anything I do, in anything I work on, in anything I write, in any setting I engage in.
You know what I feel like you're doing? There's this concept, that it keeps coming up recently. It's, that humans aren't rational beings. We're rationalizing beings.
Yes.
Like we don't think rationally, we find meaning,
Not at all.
And like that's what it sounds like you're doing in these funerals is,
Absolutely.
You're not treating others and yourself as rational beings who are trying to find like this unified meaning in this experience. But you're somebody who is, treating others as rationalizing beings and trying to like give coherent meaning like to an experience.
Mm-hmm. I am.
Maybe that's a little convoluted, but
no, it's not. Actually, if you go to my webpage and sort of scroll down, there's a little section that says, "This is what I do," and I say I'm a storyteller, and I use what's been described as an academic mind and a pastoral heart to tell stories that help you understand your story. They give meaning, significance, purpose, value, bring beauty, all of that sort of stuff into life. And so I am, in that sense, through story, I am a rationalizing person. And I try and help people create some sort of construct that they can then live in.
That's cool, dude. Well stated, well written statement. That's fantastic. I love that. Cool.
And so in that sense of those funerals where things have been shattered like that, and I say this sucks, and I'm offering a new perspective on God. I use an image of it's actually a Buddhist philosophy that ties into an art called kintsugi, which is where a broken pot is welded back together with seams of gold. And so then the new pot, its value is not in the fact that it functions like the pot or looks like the pot that existed before, but the value is seen in the beauty of the seams of gold. And so I talk about how what's happened is that our hearts have been shattered by this event. And as we get up and we start telling stories, and as we laugh, and as we cry, and as we connect to each other, and as we interact through the midst of everything that's going on, and as we talk about it, and as we give permission to, I give permission for people to be angry at God. If you want to hate God right now, that's fine. And you can hate fate or the universe, whatever you want to list, however you perceive or conceive that. If you just want to hate what's going on, do that. That's important right now. If you don't know what else to do other than to make jokes and laugh, then make jokes and laugh right now, because that's what your body needs right now. And so it just becomes this big, massive giving permission statement that we're going to come up here and we're going to tell these stories, that we're going to do what we need to do, and it's going to help each of us in different ways. But as we do that, then we're starting to pick up those shattered pieces and clean them off. And eventually then, once all those pieces are cleaned off and we figure out how they all come back together, we're going to start welding them together with gold. And we're going to recraft these, and we're going to basically recraft these hearts that have been broken. But it says, hey, it's okay that your heart's broken right now. You do not need to be okay right now. Because you know what? Things are not okay right now. But it also invites them to connect with people and to stay connected and to continue in their connection. And it becomes essentially a reworking, not only of their understanding of the divine, their thought of the divine and the rationalization of the divine, but it becomes a rationalization of their own experience. How do I make sense of this? All right, my heart's broken and it hurts to talk about this stuff, but as I do, which is from a psychological perspective, going to help them to process the trauma that they've gone through. As I do, it's going to be cleaning up my broken heart, the pieces of my broken heart, and preparing them to be put back together, which then becomes, it uses community and it reinforces community. It increases the value of the community. This community is now the body that is going to help me put myself back together. And then you get to figure out in that process, what are our new roles in community without this person?
Yeah. Some deep self-exploration, an exploration of how you relate to the world. Yeah, when that gets stripped away, it's like nothing to hold on to. So when you were giving, is the way that you officiate a funeral now, is that different from the way you did it when you were a Lutheran minister?
Oh my gosh, yes. So because I was in the conservative realm of the Lutheran Church, and so basically you are told this is how you do a funeral, this is the pattern, this is the order, and essentially you're told don't talk about the person who died.
What?
Yep.
No.
Because in that context it is not about the deceased, it's about Jesus.
Oh,
and so you are
I've been to that funeral.
Yes.
Funeral. That's not a helpful funeral.
No, it's not. And in fact, this is crazy because at one of these funerals recently where it was somebody who was younger died, I had somebody come up to me and say, you know what? 3 years ago, a college friend of mine died. This is a younger guy. And we did the whole typical funeral thing that you mentioned in your service about what's supposed to be said. And then you went on and did this whole other thing. I think today, not only did you help me with the loss of this friend who had just died, but you helped me for the first time deal with the loss of the friend who died 3 years ago, because that funeral didn't help.
Oh.
And so for 3 years, the loss of that friend sat with him and was just pressed down and stuffed in and repressed and just sat in the pit of his stomach gnawing at him. And so this other way of doing the funeral became an invitation not only for the grief he was experiencing in that moment, but for the grief that he'd been holding on to for 3 years to begin to come up and be worked with.
Man, I didn't know that was curriculum.
Yeah.
I thought when I've seen a funeral like that, I thought that was just somebody just being uncomfortable with the reality of death, you know? And that they were just using it as a crutch, which I'm sure there's some of that to it, but I can't believe that people are actually taught to focus on religious symbols rather than the person that's passing.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows what that's like when somebody just leans on religion as a crutch to make themselves feel better because like they're uncomfortable with what you're going through. Like I think everybody, no matter how religious, has been there where you go to somebody with something that's really hurting and they don't know what to say or like how to connect with you in that. So they just say, you know, I'll pray for you.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, fuck you, you know?
Exactly.
Fuck you. Like, you know, if this makes you uncomfortable, just be real about that. Don't try to pretend like, no, you know?
And I think that nails that now in quote. And that I step into those spaces and I give permission not only for grief to be real and for people to hurt and for people to be angry and for people to be, you know, whatever I said that, I don't know how many times I've said that now. Whatever you are experiencing right now is okay. There is no right way to feel in this moment. So let's sit and feel whatever we feel together. And then I'm going to take everything that the family is feeling when I meet with them, and I'm going to bring that at the funeral to everyone else who's gathered. And I'm going to invite them into that process as well. And we're all going to go through those feelings. And then I ultimately end up often turning the reception afterwards into part of the funeral itself. Because I'll say, as much as we've shared in this setting now, there's still more to share. And that's what the reception is for. And so, go talk with each other and do this work one-on-one or in small groups or however that might work, And so I think in a sense, in your traditional, like, this is the curriculum funeral, I think probably the reception is more beneficial than the service.
Yeah.
Although most often people have not been given permission to talk freely in the reception, or they haven't been given permission to actually say what they actually think or feel or wrestle with stuff. So maybe they haven't been given the tools to make the reception what it could be.
Yeah, I feel like if you don't have permission, let's say like whatever the elderly cantankerous grandpa just died, which I didn't really have him like that. So it's just a little food for thought here, but it's like everybody can stand around and be like, if they don't have permission, they can stand around and be like, yeah, he was a good guy, and everybody's kind of got to agree with that. But if you got permission to be real about something, just be, man, he was a real son of a bitch.
Yeah.
And then, everybody can be, yeah, he was, but he was whatever. He was grandpa, and there's a different weight to that,
Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, it's really, it's funny because I almost end up, because I don't know these people most of the time, I almost end up leading with the ugly of me and being okay with the ugly of me. Not in the sense that I'm going to break boundaries and spill out all of my crap and all that sort of stuff. But I lay out at some level, I can be honest with feeling in this moment or hurt in this moment, and I'm inviting you to be in the same place. So in a sense, it's not me stepping in and using them for my own therapeutic session, but there's a value that kicks back to me. I've got to be this so they can be this, so this whole community can be more.
So that where I pulled that Henry Nouwen quote from, it's the title of the book is The Wounded Healer.
Oh, I love that book. I don't even remember that quote, but I love that book.
I feel like it's a terrible book, but just like there's so many like good one-liners in there. I'm just like, oh my gosh, I could sit with these two sentences for like months, but as far as like a coherent book, I'm like, yeah.
Oh, and I don't think Nouwen stuff is ever intended to be coherent.
That's the only thing I've read of his. But no, I just wanted to come back to that title because I'm like, yeah, that's your position there, the wounded healer.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you put on a facade of the one who is not wounded, then you're not inviting anybody else to be wounded, or you're saying it's not okay to be wounded.
Yeah. I've there was this church group back when I went to church, that me and my wife were a part of. And every time I came out of that group, I just felt more dead than I did before I went in, because it's an extension to go to a group and make time for that, right?
Yeah.
But man, it just got to the point that every time we would walk out of the group, I would just turn to my wife and I'd say, "What the fuck was that?" Like, what the fuck was that? Right after the church group, being the good Christian that I was.
Absolutely.
What the fuck was that? Nobody said anything real, and I just always got frustrated, and eventually. Oh, there's a lot more to that story that I won't go into, but no,
I think lots of people can probably relate to that. It's what we're supposed to do. It's the proper thing. We're reinforcing this narrative. And I think what it ends up being is it becomes, this is how life is supposed to be. And if you don't feel comfortable in it, or if you're not thriving in it, then something is wrong. And so you then amp up more of your facade and more of the false self. And so I think so often that entire system and structure becomes the amplification of that which isn't real. And it just becomes an invitation to slap on more of that which isn't real. And I think to jump back to the funeral sense, death invites us to reconsider what we know is real. Trauma of any kind, and so death is one of those traumas. Trauma of any kind becomes an invitation to reconsider what we believe is real, or reconsider what we think of as real or understand as real.
Trauma of any kind becomes an invitation for us to reconsider what we think is real.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. That's going to be one I'm going to think on for a bit. There's a lot to that. Yeah. I think we need a little trauma every day, because I think we always need to reconsider what is real.
Mm-hmm. Or we might just need to face some of the trauma that we have stacked up in our past.
Yeah.
I think most of us probably have piles of it that we could pull from, but we often just end up stuffing it in the closet, locking it away somewhere. So maybe we just need to pull out a piece of that which has already happened every day.
Yeah.
But I think trauma will continue to happen every day too. So I think either way, you're right.
Well, hey, I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. This has been fun.
I think we've popped around a bit, so I'm probably gonna do a bit of editing to make it a little more coherent. But do you have any other pearls of wisdom from your experience for people trying to build community?
Oh gosh. And maybe it just becomes a simple: don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to be real before others, which is so hard. I mean, that's I'm sure there are people in my life who would hear me say, don't be afraid to be authentic, and would just be like, you two-faced piece of shit. Because I cannot tell you how many years I have lived with the facade of authenticity, and how much fear has driven my life and the way that it has destroyed community that I've been a part of, whether that's a marriage, a friendship, a church, any of those settings. And I've even gone to the round of like, oh, what we really need is be vulnerable. And then I ended up being inauthentically vulnerable. It was crafted vulnerability was my ex used to describe my vulnerability that way. It's all crafted. It gives the impression that people are actually getting to know you, but they actually don't get to. But they feel like they do. But you're still safe because you're afraid. And so I say that, and I look at it, and I say it realizing that I say it as much to myself as I do to anybody else. And I don't need to explain it all away or dismiss it or justify it or, instead it's how do I learn and live well moving forward? And how do I be more authentic and more real and more genuine moving forward? And how do I live without that fear moving forward? And then how do I invite other people to live without that fear moving forward? Because that becomes the cure to the very thing that plagued me for so long.
Hey, I dig it. That's good wisdom right there.
And that's I think where most of life for me is these days. And I think funerals are a part of that.
Well, thanks so much for taking so much time to talk, man. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. This has been fun. It was fun because I didn't know exactly what was going to happen when we sat down, and I assumed that we're going to end up bouncing all over the place. And I tend to do that anyway. I tend to tell stories and run down. Like I'll start and run down a narrative, and then swing back around and reconnect to it and shoot off in a new direction. And I love doing that. And so I'm really thankful that it could be a gift to you and hopefully a gift to everybody else who listens to the podcast.
I'm not sure if we had a good conversation, but I think we did some good exploring.
Absolutely.
at least individually, And
yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that's what's needed right now, and we can be okay with that.
Well, there you have it. Me and Joe Burnham. What a conversation. I love that one. All right. Well, I'll catch you back here in 2 weeks. And until next time, stay safe, stay sane. And you know by now, most importantly, stay curious.